Have you ever come across an argument or a finding online or elsewhere, and you just think, that doesn't make a lot of sense? Hopefully you have, because this means that you are trying to be a good judge of good versus bad logic. Now, this is a very important skill to have because with the online era, with misinformation, and with a lot of conflicting evidence, data, and research, it is important to know what kinds of information can we believe and what kinds of information can we not. And truth be told, the best way to figure that out is to see if the logical soundness of that argument is something that you can believe. Is it backed up enough? Is there enough evidence? And do they avoid logical errors? And that's something we're going to talk about today. How can we point out and figure out which things seem to be logical fallacies or logical errors? So one of the very important things to recognize when we talk about good and bad logic is that we need to know when A actually leads to B. That's a really important thing. And this is called correlation versus causation. So correlation means when two particular variables or things have similar trends or patterns. Causation is when two variables are directly related and one causes the other. A causes B. So let me give you an example. A very classic one is the incidence or the prevalence of ice cream sales and shark attacks. These two things are very much correlated. There are more ice cream sales during the summer months and more shark attacks during the summer months. And if you look at a graph and you plotted the amount of ice cream sales and shark attacks, they will actually have very similar trends and lines. But the thing is, are these things just correlated because they do seem to be similar, or are they also causative, as in one is causing the other? Well, let's think about it. If we were to stop buying ice cream altogether, would we eliminate all shark attacks? Probably not, right? And if we increased ice cream sales, people doubled the amount of ice cream they bought, would we also double the amount of shark attacks? Also probably not. So this is an example where something is correlated. They seem to be similar, but they're not causative. One isn't causing the other. Now, this is something that's very, very important to look out for because this is something that a lot of different kinds of sources might use as evidence, when in reality it's just correlation. Another thing that you should keep in mind when looking at logic is something called abductive reasoning. Abductive reasoning is a great mental shortcut, and basically it means when you take the easiest or simplest explanation that is most available to you as the true one. So let's say you're at a cafe and you see a laptop open just on a table and a cup of coffee right next to it and nobody's there. You could think, someone has gifted me this laptop and this free coffee. How wonderful of them. But how likely is that? Probably not very likely, right? The most reasonable and logical explanation in that moment is someone probably got up momentarily, went to the washroom, got some tissues, and they will be back very shortly. So in this situation, abductive reasoning, the most simplest and most likely explanation, just accepting that as truth, probably is a okay and fine thing to do. But there are other instances in which abductive reasoning might not always be the best thing. For example, in medicine, if you say, well, the common cold is most common, it's in the name. So if a patient comes in sick and you say, well, statistically, most likely, you probably just have the common cold. Here, go take some medication, cough medicine and go home. And then they end up having a more severe disease. So in these situations, abductive reasoning isn't always the best thing. The last thing to take into consideration is the idea of inductive reasoning, which can sometimes be very helpful, but sometimes backfire. So inductive reasoning is when we make generalizations or assumptions about a larger group of people with a solidified finding of a smaller group. Let me explain. Let's say you have a neighbor, and the neighbor you have happens to also be a grandfather. And let's say your neighbor also happens to be bald. Well, now you have a sample size of one. This one person, you notice that you have a neighbor who is bald and also a grandfather. An inductive reasoning would say, well, I've observed that this person has these characteristics, so that must mean all grandfathers are bald. Now you can see that this is kind of a ridiculous generalization to make. Perhaps it is too general. But inductive reasoning is based on the premise of taking a smaller proven thing and trying to generalize it where appropriate. And speaking of generalization, this is a very, very important tool within science, but we need to make sure we're doing it right. The reason we do generalization is because we simply could not study every single person. If we were to do a study on diabetes, a very common and very prevalent disease affecting a lot of people in a lot of countries, we could theoretically try and study every single individual person with diabetes, and then we'll get the best big picture. We don't need to make any assumptions or generalizations whatsoever. But I'm sure you've, thought by now, studying every single person with diabetes would be difficult. There's, first of all, millions, and this is going to cost a lot of money. Most people probably don't even want to be part of the study. There's the list is endless for why this wouldn't actually work in terms of practical experience and actually practically doing this as a research study. So what we have to do within science is we have to take a smaller group, and we have to study that smaller group. So we take a population sample of people living with diabetes, and then we find those results and we try to generalize those results to people. Now, when it comes to generalization, you need to make it appropriate. So let's say that you studied a group of people living with diabetes in Canada, and you generalize that data to all Canadians living with diabetes. That would be a reasonable extension and generalization of the study's results. But let's say instead you said, we studied a few people in Canada. However, we're going to generalize this data to all people with diabetes in the entire world. This may be an overgeneralization, because the situations and the standards that exist in Canada may differ from other countries. But what is overgeneralization? Overgeneralization is where you take a finding or a piece of information and you apply it into situations where it is inappropriate, where you don't have enough evidence or enough backing to suggest that it actually can be applied to that bigger population. Other countries might have different health systems, different medications, different access, and all these other different factors, which makes it even harder and harder to generalize that data and information. So you need to make sure you're not overgeneralizing, because this happens far too often. A lot of people say, oh, look at this scientific study done in this one particular US state. Well, it must be true for the entire world, especially news media outlets or websites that are trying to give you health tips and tricks and health hacks. They will take very, very specific information done from a very specific population and will assume that it is true of every single person, but that is simply not the case. The other tip with generalization is it's better when you have more people in your sample size, or in other words, you've studied more people in your research. So let's say I'm doing a study to see if all apples taste good. If I just taste 5 apples, I could generalize to all other apples, but if I taste 100 apples, I would feel a lot more comfortable generalizing that information and data because I've gotten a bigger piece of the pie and I've studied more apples and therefore I'm more confident. So that's another really big part about generalization. The last thing you need to know is that even if there's good or bad logic, sometimes people can be stuck in their ways, and that often comes from a place of being resistant to change. Resistance to change comes in many forms. And it's not just being stubborn, as a lot of people may believe, but it's also a matter of self-preservation and making sure that your own identity is intact. And that might sound overly deep, but there is some truth to this. It's a self-defense mechanism. Our own beliefs, our thoughts, and our opinions about the world shape who we are, and when those things are challenged, we feel at threat. To try and eliminate those threats, we try and, instead of opening our minds to other perspectives, opinions, and maybe perhaps we got it wrong, we would rather actually double down and justify what we currently know and understand to be our world, because that seems to be the safer option. The other thing that people do in self-preservation, and similar to the first thing we just explained, is confirmation bias, which is where you use information that already explains and backs up your existing opinion. Whereas you will actually ignore opinions or data or studies that contradict your current opinion. So that means that you're constantly looking for information that validates yourself and ignoring information that goes against your values, beliefs, or opinions. And the last thing is that people are very self-defensive. And this is, again, a self-defense mechanism in that there's something called fundamental attribution error, where we are more likely to choose external reasons for our own shortcomings, but internal reasons for others' shortcomings. So for example, let's say you failed a test. You're more likely to say, I failed the test because I didn't get enough sleep and the test was just overly hard, so on and so forth. External factors outside of your control. Whereas if someone else had failed that test, you're more likely to attribute it to internal factors, such as, that person probably isn't smart enough, that person's probably lazy and didn't work hard for that test. So those kinds of discrepancies kind of go to show that yes, you can work hard to find the differences between good and bad logic, but there is going to be some kind of resistance to change that a lot of people have inherent to who they are and inherent to trying to preserve their own self-identity. So be patient with people. Don't get too caught up in trying to only use logic as a way to convince people, but also reassure them that it's okay to keep an open mind. So at the end of the day, make sure that you keep your eyes peeled and your mind open when you're looking at any kinds of studies or research that you do online, because that might be the best way to overcome your own resistance to change and truly find the opinions, research, and data that you need to find for whatever you may be doing in your life. Thanks for watching.